An entry in last year's art prize sparked a lot of conversation about America's history with racial issues.
A quilt with thousands of names stitched into it, the names of lynching victims in the U.S. And 2 of those people were killed here in Michigan. Since then, our Lauren Edwards has been on a quest to learn more about their lives and legacies. She's live in the newsroom now with the story. Lauren?
Janice, Josh, I'll never forget the first time I saw that quilt and just simply being in awe. And I also quickly looked to see how many people were lynched in Michigan. Each of the states were listed on it and found that there were 2 men listed. Now, over the past few days, I've been to Holt, Michigan and Port Huron and learning more about, what happened and who they were. And I just want to warn everyone that some of the images you're about to see are disturbing.
To see that many names in one place of people who were lynched, mainly unfairly, was surprising. Had people in tears.
It was called Strange Fruit, a century of lynching and murder, 1865 to 1965. 5,000 names of the men, women, and children sewn onto this 10-foot quilt, which was on display during Art Prize last fall at the Grand Rapids African American Museum and Archives.
People were impressed with the workmanship. They also loved the fact that it told about history. Including
the men lynched in Michigan. Museum curator George Byard was intrigued.
Started doing a little research, and it just surprised me, shocked me, that in Holt, Michigan, Ingham County, there was a man, John Taylor, who was lynched. He was African American.
So I drove over an hour away to Holt and saw a sign in his honor, named John Taylor Memorial Park, erected in 2018.
He had moved to Michigan. He was a Civil War soldier, fought in the Michigan First colored troops of Michigan.
Taylor worked as a farmhand after the war for a local farmer named Mr. Buck.
Quite a good worker. But Buck wasn't paying him what he should get, so he went down the road and another farmer said, well, I'll pay you more.
However, Taylor wanted his back pay from Mr. Buck, so in August 1866, Taylor knocked on his door to get the money.
Mr. Buck's wife, daughter, and mother-in-law were there, and he kind of startled them because he came in looking for Mr. Buck, and somehow an outburst or something happened, and they ended up getting injured with an axe.
Byard says Taylor asked for the $4 owed to him. In 2022, that would be the equivalent to a couple $100, according to Byard. After confronting the family, Taylor left.
Mr. Buck came back to his house and saw that his wife and daughter and mother-in-law were injured. And so, of course, he called the cops and, they tracked him down.
Taylor said he was innocent, but rumors and falsehoods spread quickly about the incident.
What happened was that the news media, like it is now sometimes, kind of exaggerated the story, said that they were murdered. So the townspeople all thought that they were murdered.
Over a dozen newspapers reported on the lynching. One article saying that crime sent, quote, a shudder of horror through the whole county. Another adding it was diabolical, and 200 men showed up at his jail cell.
Opened the cell door, yanked him out, put a rope around his neck, dragged him a couple blocks, and threw him over a train trestle and hung him.
Now, after the lynching of Mr. Taylor in 1866, things were quiet. But then it happened again over 20 years later and 130 miles east in Port Huron. So that's where I went next, but stopped in Detroit at the Charles H. Wright African American History Museum.
The country was still trying to find itself after the end of slavery, Reconstruction, and things like that. So there was very difficult times for people of African descent here in the state of Michigan.
Including Albert Martin, who lived in Port Huron in 1889, says museum educator Doug McCrae.
Albert Martin, unfortunately, was the victim of a lynching for the same reason that many African American men had been lynched, because he was accused of raping a white woman.
In May of that year, Martin, a biracial man, was thrown in jail for allegedly assaulting a white woman.
And for that reason, he was attacked and he was also lynched.
This newspaper clipping says that night the sheriff went to bed and, quote, at 2 o'clock, my wife called me and said that a crowd was in front of the jail. He then went to his window, fired 2 shots in the air to get them to disperse. Another officer said, quote, the crowd had the man out just as we arrived and were dragging him to the 7th Street Bridge. Another says, quote, 40 men had a hold of the rope when we reached the bridge. As he was strung up, a man stood off and shot him. The crowd then left and Sheriff Mann took the body down.
He was hanging from that bridge. That was the, I guess, the final portion of the punishment that was meted out upon him, because basically they mutilated him in several different ways.
McCrae says that was common in those days, to mutilate the body and take parts as souvenirs.
Lynching was heinous in its own right. But then, in America, it became an event. Sunday afternoon, we're going to hang a black person.
Both Baird and McCrae mentioned that one other person was lynched, Till Warner, up in Sheboygan in 1883 for allegedly assaulting a white child.
It was the same thing that happened to so many African-American men, is because that was always considered to be a very, very sound and reasonable excuse for attacking a person and killing them.
And McCrae says the path forward to not repeating the past is education.
If we learn more about what lynching was all about and recognize the effect that it has had, the negative effect that it has had from back then until now, and we can improve that going forward.
Now, there is legislation in Congress that would, for the first time, designate lynching as a federal hate crime. It's called the Emmett Anti-Lynching Act, and it remains stuck in committee right now. And supporters hope it'll get passed and bring some justice to the thousands of victims, including the few here in Michigan. Reporting live in the newsroom, Lauren Edwards, Fox 17 News.
Some very important history there. Lauren, thank you.